medicine doctor. I have my own clinic here in Talisay, and I am a consultant in Chonghua Hospital, and also currently I'm the emergency room unit head in Southwestern University Medical Center, formerly called Sacred Heart Hospital. I'm a reviewer in Cracking the Boards, so maybe 4 years from now, when you take the board, we will see each other there again. I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, and I'm a vaccine advocate, meaning if I'm not in my clinic or not making rounds or not giving lectures, I am there volunteering in the vaccination site because I believe the faster we can vaccinate people, the faster we can reach herd immunity. So I know you're busy going to school, so you can help us not by going there and volunteering, but maybe helping and convincing others to go and vaccinate, have themselves vaccinated. And of course, I am not ashamed to say that I am a BTS army. So because that has helped me go through a lot, no, of this pandemic and madness. So before we begin, I will just if you're wondering that if I'm that person you see in your Maham website or in some tarpaulins or in some newspapers sometimes, no, yes, that's me. I am that girl who topped the board exam before, no, maybe younger looking and also thinner looking. Um, but I'm not saying that to brag, but rather I'm saying that, no, to inspire you guys na it could happen also to you, somebody from Cebu or not from Manila, just studying here in Cebu can actually just get number one in the board exam. And if that can happen to you. So what I'm trying to drive at here is that I'd like to share a few tips, no? Because I've been there. I've been in your situation before. So I think that the best way, if you want to get, if you want to top the board exam, then that's a great dream. It was not my dream before to get number one, but maybe top, no? So, but the Lord has been very good and kind. So what I can share to you is if you want to do the same, if you want to, get also, if not top, but really get a good grade during the board exams, the best time to start preparing is today, is now when you're first year, no? Because you need to get really good foundation with all this medical knowledge that you have. And um, I'm not saying that you copy my style because I think it's not healthy, lalo na because it's the pandemic now. But when I was in first year, I only slept around 1 to 2 hours. 1 to 2 hours because I really studied, for the tomorrow's lecture. I didn't want to come and not be prepared because medicine is hard. Now there's a saying na if it's easy, then it's not medicine. So expect things to become difficult. Okay, if you think it's difficult now, it will not get any easier. Okay, I'm not scaring you, but I'm just presenting the truth. So you really have to be diligent. But apart from that, you need to find the balance between studies and also your personal life. No, so do not neglect your family, do not neglect your friends as well. And most importantly, love yourself and have a time for God. No? Whoever God you serve. But it doesn't really necessarily know that you have to have the same God as I have. But I think that you just need to surrender to a higher power. It is my hope that after physiology or after your basic sciences in first year, you will gain a great appreciation for life and you will be able to really appreciate how great, no, the creator is, especially as we go along and study about the intricacies, no, of life in here in physiology. So with that said, I'm sensible and approachable. No, if you have any questions, you can ask me. Um, just don't just don't test me because I'm also very I can also be basta, don't test me. So if you have any questions, you feel free to interrupt me. I'll try to answer them. No, if you can't voice them out, you can type them on the chat box. So with that said, let's now begin. I am tasked to talk to you about 4 chapters in Gaiton. And today we just lecture on chapter 5. So our reference for this is your 14th edition of your Gaiton. So let's stick to that because some editions would have other values. So for the values, um, we will just be focusing on the 14th edition. So chapter 5, it will tell us, or we're going to be discussing about membrane potential and action potential. So the basic physics of membrane potentials. A concentration difference of ions across a selectively permeable membrane can produce a membrane potential. So that's the premise, okay? So I believe that have already discussed with Dr. Oclarit, no, the different types of movement, no, between selectively permeable membranes. For example, your diffusion, and we also learned about your active transport. So what it's saying is that if there is a concentration difference, no, and if there is a membrane between that concentration difference, then you can produce a membrane potential, or meaning you can produce a voltage. No? There is a current. So if we are going to discuss about membrane potential, or there is voltage or charge in our membranes, there are 2 ions that are responsible for this charge. No? If you have no more neurons in your brain because you're so tired of studying and you need to remember only one thing or 2 things, no? If you're asked what are the ions that contribute to the charge of the membrane or the membrane potential, then the answer would be potassium and sodium. So first, let's talk about potassium. So just fix your eyes in this part of this image in letter A. So the potassium or the neuronal, the cell membrane of the neuron is highly permeable to potassium ions. No? So potassium comes in and out freely through the cell membrane. Sorry. Potassium, because we know that potassium is abundant inside a cell, no? And you know that the law of diffusion is that from a higher concentration, the substance goes to the lower concentration. So because potassium is abundant inside the cell, it will diffuse outward because of the high concentration inside the cell. So take note that potassium has a charge. It's charge +1, right? So if potassium leaves the cell, it brings out the positivity. So the potassium, which is positive, goes out of the cell. So the cell becomes negative. There is a negative potential or charge inside the cell. So this will continue to happen. No? Potassium will continue to leak out because of the potassium leak channels. Potassium will continue to leak out of the cell until it reaches a certain voltage, until it reaches a certain charge. And that charge is around negative 94 millivolts. And this negative 94 millivolts is what we call your potassium diffusion potential. So we say potassium diffusion potential, which is the value is negative 94 millivolts. This is the charge, or this is the potential wherein potassium stops going out of the cell. Okay? Did you get that?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, I
Yes,
think
Doc.
that's easy. Okay. So the negative 94, once, diba, here, the original state was that this was supposed to be positive because potassium is here. But when potassium leaves the cell becomes, starts to become negative until it reaches negative 94. And then when it reaches negative 94, potassium stops going out. No? So that's what you mean by your diffusion potential. It is the charge in which a certain ion will stop moving into or out of the cell. So that is your potassium diffusion potential. So as I said, aside from potassium, we also have sodium. So just the same concept, no? Na, however, it's the same concept. However, the sodium is more abundant outside of the cell. No? So since it's more abundant, again, law of diffusion, it goes from high to low. So from outside, it goes inside. And you know that sodium is charged +1, so it's positive. So it brings the positivity inside the cell. So sodium will cause the cell to be more positive. No? So this will happen, this will continue to happen, sodium going into the cell until the cell reaches a certain voltage or a certain potential. And for sodium, that value is a positive 61 millivolts. So once the cell inside will reach the positive 61 millivolts, sodium stops going inside. And that is the sodium diffusion potential. So as you can see, each ion in the body has a diffusion potential. Okay, each ion has a diffusion potential. So how did these people came up with these numbers, no? And that is the Nernst potential. So there was a scientist named Nernst. He named this. So when you say Nernst potential, is just the same as your diffusion potential. So the definition of a Nernst potential, it is a membrane potential that prevents net diffusion of an ion in either direction through the membrane. So this is how you solve your Nernst potential. EMF is the electromotive force, and this is measured in millivolts, and that is equal to the concentration inside of the ion and over the concentration outside. And then you find the logarithmic, you find the logarithm of this answer. You times it with 61, which is a constant, over Z. Z is the charge of the ion, and you will get the Nernst potential or the diffusion potential. So take note that the sign, no, of your Nernst potential, it is negative if the ion that is from the cell and from the ion that is in the cell would go out of the cell, then the answer would be a negative. So for example, just remember, no, what happens with potassium. So potassium, you get the concentration of potassium inside the cell over the concentration outside the cell. Do the logarithm of that, multiply it with 61, and you divide this with the charge of potassium. So that is a +1. And then you will get a negative answer. You get a negative answer because your potassium is a positive ion, and then when it goes out of the cell, it will bring the positivity outside the cell. So the potential or the Nernst potential inside the cell or the membrane becomes negative. No? Another concept we have to understand is your Goldman equation, otherwise known as your Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation. So do not be afraid of the longer formula. No, it's easier to understand, or it will be easy to understand. No, Goldman equation. This is used to calculate the diffusion potential when the membrane is permeable to several different ions. So in the Nernst potential, as you can see, we have this concentration inside, concentration outside. Nernst potential involves only one ion. Now there is for every ion there is a Nernst potential. And we understand that it's not only potassium that contributes to the charge of your membrane. No, it's not only potassium. I told you there's also sodium, and there are other ions, no, like for example, chloride, that also contributes to the membrane potential, to the charge of your membrane. So how do we know, or how will we arrive at the membrane potential? And that is through your Goldman equation. So this is how to calculate it. So the concentration of your sodium, and then you multiply it with P of the sodium, P meaning permeability of the sodium through the membrane. And then you add this to another ion, no, the concentration of potassium times the permeability of potassium, no, and so on and so forth. And then you get the logarithm, multiply it with 61. So you use the Goldman equation for computing the membrane potential when there is already involvement of many ions. No? And this is the one that is really true to what it is in real life, no? Because it really involves a lot of ions, not just one, to create the membrane potential. So what factors affect your diffusion potential or your Nernst potential? Number one, or your membrane potential. Number one, you have your polarity of the electrical charge of each ion. So we've already said this countless of times na, for example, so polarity meaning the charge of the ion. So your potassium is positive, it goes out of the cell, it brings out the positivity. So what is left is negativity inside the cell, or a negative diffusion potential. Another factor is the permeability of the membrane to each ion. So for example, as I mentioned, that your neuron cell membrane is very permeable to potassium. Very permeable to potassium. So for example, your potassium is 100 times more permeable to the cell membrane compared to your sodium. No? And another factor is your C, or concentration. So concentration inside and outside of the cell. So sodium, potassium, and chloride ions, they are major contributors to the membrane potential in the neurons and muscle fibers. And take note that the voltage of an ion is proportional to the membrane permeability for that particular ion. So meaning, if you just disregard the negative or the plus sign of each ion, for example, um, your potassium is negative 94. So if you just get the absolute value 94, so that's very high compared to the sodium, which is 61. So meaning na your potassium is much more permeable through the membrane compared to your your sodium. Okay. So a positive ion concentration gradient from inside the membrane to the outside causes electronegativity inside the membrane. So this is very, we already discussed this. Now, positive ion concentration, so meaning like potassium inside the cell will go out of the cell and will cause electronegativity inside the cell. Okay. So the rapid changes in sodium and potassium permeability are primarily responsible for signal transmission in neurons. So as I mentioned, it's always the major players in your membrane potential is sodium and potassium. Now we go to another concept we call electrochemical driving force. So electrochemical driving force. This is the difference between the membrane potential, your VM, and minus the equilibrium potential of the ion. VEQ, or equilibrium potential, we can also say your diffusion potential. So for example, if you have a calculator there, you can try so to solve your VDF. So VM, let's say the membrane potential of your ion your membrane potential of the cell is around negative 90. So for example, if it's negative 90 and you minus it with the diffusion potential of potassium. What is the diffusion potential of potassium?
Negative 94.
Negative 94.
Correct.
94.
Negative 94. Correct. So what is your answer? What is the BDF? Negative 90 minus negative 94. You can use your calculator.
$75.
Negative 90 minus negative 94.
Negative 184.
Negative 184.
Positive 4.
Positive 4.
Very
no?
good.
Positive.
Positive 4. Unsa man na inyong calculator? kanang review your answer. The correct answer is 4, positive 4. Okay? Just be tanawa daw sa inyong kanang integer sign basin wa niyo nabutang ano. So I mentioned your membrane potential is negative 90. We minus it, no? Negative 90 minus negative period na 94. Diba? We make that a plus sign. So the answer should be positive 4. And that is important actually. The thing that we're looking at is actually just the charge, no? Or if what we're looking for is if the answer is positive or negative, no? So for that, for potassium, the negative 90 minus negative 94, the answer is positive 4. So take note of this principle. Now, if we're looking for the cation, or so like your potassium, if your answer is a positive value, then the movement of that ion is inside the cell, it moves out of the cell. No? Moves out of the cell. So just like your potassium is from the inside because the answer to your VDF is positive, it goes out of the cell. You can also try it now with sodium. You try sodium. So negative 90 minus, what's the Nernst potential of sodium?
Negative
61.
Plus 61.
Is it negative
Yes.
61?
61, Doc.
Correct.
61.
Positive 61. Correct. So what's your answer this time? What's the VDF of
151.
sodium? Huh?
Negative 151.
Negative 1.5.
Correct. Negative 151. So just always be cautious with your sign, no, with the value, or is it positive or negative? Because that is important in your VDF. Because as you can see, if the answer to your VDF, no, if you're solving for a cation, meaning positive charge siya, once your VDF, the answer is negative, just like for sodium, negative 151, then the direction is sodium will move into the cell. No? Sodium will move into the cell. So that is your electrochemical driving force. So this is the principle that you have to remember, no, for cations. For anion, just remember that it's the opposite. See, it's the opposite. So instead of if you have a positive VDF for an anion, then diba here for sodium and potassium, for potassium, if the VDF is positive, it moves out of the cell. Here in the anion, no, if we solve for chloride, it's the opposite. So it moves into the cell. And if your VM, if your membrane is the value is the same as your membrane or the diffusion potential of the ion, then there is no movement. Because what will happen is that, for example, negative 90 minus also an ion that has Nernst potential of negative 90. So it will have no movement. It will cancel out each other. So did you get that? No, just be careful when you solve it. No, with the signs, because you might get wrong just because you did not put the positive sign or the negative sign. So how do we measure the membrane potential in real life? It's really very hard because in theory we have these numbers, no, we have these concepts, we imagine things, but in reality, in real life, it's hard because the cells are very small. But this is how it is measured, no, in different laboratories, like in really those really scientific laboratories, wherein they will be using a microelectrode. And they will attach this or poke this into the nerve. This is a chart or a table of the different resting membrane potential in the different cell types. So I highlighted neurons there because further in our talk today, we will be talking more about neurons. So the neurons' usual resting potential is about negative 70 millivolts. Sometimes it goes up if the nerve is very large, the trunk fiber is very large, it may reach mga negative 90. You have your muscles, whether it's skeletal, smooth, cardiac here. You also have the hair in the cochlea, astrocytes, and even your erythrocyte. Your erythrocyte, or your red blood cells, they're not excitable cells, no. However, even if they're not excitable cells, they also have a membrane potential because, diba, what we mentioned, as long as there is a selectively permeable membrane, as long as there is a concentration gradient, then there will always be a charge in your membrane or in that cell. And we also have membrane potentials for your photoreceptors. Now let's go to the resting membrane potential. So when you say resting membrane potential, this is the charge of the membrane when no stimulus is happening. No, it's like, for example, resting. It's from the word itself, resting. There's no stimulus, no action potential. The cell is just chilling. No, it's resting. But before we go to the resting membrane potential, let me show to you first these two important mga channels or pumps. No. So I'm sure you have been talking about this with Dr. Oclarit. For sodium potassium pump, is this active or passive transport?
Active.
Active, ma'am. Active.
Active.
Okay, it's active, just as the same as active as you guys. So I'm happy. No? I think you really had what? Hello, are you lagging? Okay, so no, okay. So it's active, no? It's as active as you guys. So we know that your sodium potassium pump is an active transport. Why? Number one, because you see ATP, right? ATP. So when you say active transport, it involves the use of energy, and the energy in the form of ATP. So aside from that, your sodium potassium pump is different, diba? Because in diffusion, the law of diffusion is from higher to lower concentration. But your sodium potassium pump goes against the diffusion gradient, no? Or the concentration gradient. So you know that your sodium is more outside, your potassium is more inside. However, look at your sodium potassium pump. Your pump will cause movement of sodium from inside to outside. No, so it is against the concentration gradient. And your potassium is pumped back inside, again, against the concentration gradient. So this kind of pump, we also call this an electrogenic pump. Electrogenic pump because it will produce a charge, no? Because as you can see, 3 positive sodium ions are brought outside, while only 2 positive potassium ions are brought inside. So technically 3 minus 2, there is one charge, no? One positive charge that you lose every time you use the sodium potassium pump, because more positive ions are brought outside. So the cell becomes more negative, no? Okay, 3 minus 2. So you have 1 positive charge or that is lost. So the cell becomes more negative. Another concept is your potassium leak channels. Your potassium leak channels, is it passive or active transport?
Passive.
Passive. Okay, you have to answer with conviction. Don't ask me, no? Passive? No, don't say that, okay? Dapat passive, no? Murag nasa game ka na baba. Because you're correct, no? It's passive. Number one, you don't see ATP. So it definitely does not need energy. And as you can see, potassium leak channels, potassium from inside goes outside. So diba, that's really the law, no? Higher concentration to lower concentration. So this is a passive transport. What kind of passive transport?
Sorry?
What kind of passive
Facilitated.
Very good.
Facilitated.
Yes.
Facilitated.
Yes. Okay, facilitated diffusion, diba? When you say simple diffusion, it doesn't need a channel, it doesn't need an ion core, but this one has. No, this is a channel. So this is a facilitated diffusion. So this potassium leak channels, this is the one that this is the one that is responsible when we say that your membrane, no, even at rest, your cell membrane is very permeable to potassium. And it's because of this, your potassium leak channel. So your potassium freely goes out of the cell until it reaches the negative 94, and so it stops going out, no? Because of this leak channels right here. Now we go and talk about the resting membrane potential. So what is the current, or what is the charge of your cell membrane while it is just at rest, no? So before that, before we delve onto that, just fix yourself first with these numbers, no? And we will use, for the sake of uniformity, we will use these numbers, no? Because in other books it will be different. However, again, because our Bible for Physio is Gaiton, then we use this, and it's the 14th edition. So let's say that the sodium concentration outside the cell is 142. Your sodium concentration inside is 14. Potassium outside is 4. And potassium inside, because it's more concentrated inside, it's 140. And then we can get the ratio, no? So this is important once we would like to solve using the Nernst potential and also the Goldman equation. So for sodium, the ratio inside and outside is 0.1, okay? And then for potassium, the ratio is 35. So you really can see that potassium is greater inside than your sodium. So with that said, let's first, this looks like a busy picture, but hopefully after we discuss, you will be able to appreciate it more. So this picture just tells us the origin of your resting membrane potential, okay? So in large neurons, or even in muscles, no, in a cell, the usual resting membrane potential is around negative 90 millivolts, no? So the question is, how did we reach that value? No, when we have already said that to reach this value, we need to consider several ions. So first, let's start with your potassium, no? Because we know that potassium is more permeable in the cell membrane. So in fact, as I mentioned, it's 100 times more permeable than sodium. So let's try to, using these numbers, try to solve for your Nernst potential of your potassium. Can you still recall the formula of your Nernst potential? You try to substitute the numbers there substitute the values there with this number. You need to have a scientific calculator for this, no? Are you also solving there in your seats? Who has an answer now? What is the Nernst potential of potassium with this value that you have?
-1, Doc.
-1? No, dear. Did you use the Nernst potential equation?
Yes, Doc, but I'm still trying to figure it out.
Sige, no problem. So, who else has a different answer?
Doc, is it 94?
Negative 94.
Esguerra. Sige, let me have Esguerra. You're correct on
94.
-94. How did you get the -94?
dividing the concentration inside over concentration outside in the
Okay,
logarithm.
so what is your answer for that?
Negative 94.18.
Let's go first with the first step. So you had your potassium inside over potassium outside. What's your value for that?
It's 35.
Correct, no? 35. So you got the logarithm of 35.
Yes.
Afterwards,
Multiply it to 61.
okay, and then
That's it. No.
you're correct now. You multiply it with negative 61, diba?
Yes,
That's
sir.
the negative 61. So, and then you're missing one more thing to do from the formula. Diba? You have to divide it over Z, no, which is the charge of your potassium. Correct?
Yes, Doc.
So you will have to divide your answer over positive 1.
Yes, the
Right?
charge of
Okay,
potassium.
so because of the charge of potassium is 1. So your answer is a negative 94. Correct. Did everybody get that?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
So that's the first contributor to the resting membrane potential, no? Potassium. Because of the potassium leak channels, it's very permeable to the membrane. The second factor is, of course, we understand that it's not only potassium that contributes to the resting membrane potential. We also have sodium, no, and even other ions. But for the sake of this discussion, it's sodium, no? It's more potassium and sodium. So now that we know that sodium also has a membrane potential, no, we also have, diba, we mentioned before that sodium has a charge of positive 61. So we have to combine the charge of your sodium and the charge of potassium. So what are we going to use to solve? Correct. Correct. So Goldman equation. So using the values here, this one, you're given the value of sodium and inside, outside, no? Try to calculate down your Goldman's equation. And if you're confused on what value you should use for P or your permeability, so as I mentioned, your potassium is 100 times more permeable. So you can use that for your P. So potassium, the P is 100. And for sodium, the P is just 1. Because it's 100 times more permeable than sodium. Sige daw, what is your answer for the Goldman equation?
Negative 60.98, no?
Negative what?
Negative 60.98.
Negative 60? 60?
Yes, no.
No.
Neg-
Try again.
negative 141, Doc.
No. Try daw again. But you're correct, no? It's a negative answer.
Negative 12, Doc.
No. Can you see my whiteboard?
Yes, no.
Yes, Doc.
Can you see? Did you get it? Did
69,
you what?
Negative 69.
No. But did you arrive to this, at least this this part here? No, this is for sodium. So concentration of sodium inside times the permeability. I mentioned 1. You can use the value of 1. Because potassium is 100 times more permeable to sodium. So 14 sodium inside times permeability over sodium outside times the permeability.
Negative
Plus,
86, Doc.
correct. Very good. Who said that?
Me, Doc.
Marky. Okay, correct now. Marky is correct. Sige, Marky, how did you arrive to a negative 86?
I tried po, Doc, the one you have wrote in the whiteboard po, Doc.
So so if you solve that, you will have negative 61, no? What did you times, or what value did you get for log?
Ma'am, I just no.
What is the answer here? Where's Marky? Marky. So if you
55.
what?
1.55.
3.43, Doc. Wait.
This one here? What will you, diba, if you solve this and you solve this, your answer should be what here?
Wait, Doc, it was erased po, Doc.
You erased it.
I was taking it back. Deleting it back.
Okay, but to make it simpler, no, the answer should be around 25.8 here. So okay, you try solving. What is the logarithm of 25.8? And then now you multiply it with negative 61. If you reach this answer, then you got the correct answer.
for the log of 25.8, Doc, is 1.40411, Doc.
Yes,
1.42.
correct. And then you multiply it with 61.
Yes, Doc, negative 69.
Yes. So you more or less you reach 86. A
Yes, ma'am.
negative 86, no? Whatever pa na diri. Basta you got negative 86. Okay? Sige lang. If you didn't get it now, just practice, no? Just practice later on your spare time. You can practice. Basta you have to get the answer should be around negative 86. So, and you know you're correct, no? If you get the negative 86, because here, see, the value, if you get the Goldman equation, is negative 86. And then, so now we already saw that your potassium, sorry, and then your sodium will contribute to the resting membrane potential. So your negative 94 is your potassium. When we add the sodium value, it will become, the cell will become negative 86. So as you can see, because the charge of sodium is positive, the cell becomes a bit more positive, diba? So because of the addition of your sodium, which is more positive, the cell becomes more positive, diba? From negative 94, it becomes negative 86. Even if it's also a negative charge, but you know that it's nearer to zero. So this is actually more positive than this one. However, you remember now we have your sodium potassium pump, no, inside your or in the cell membrane. So, diba, your sodium will take out or the sodium will bring out 3 ions of sodium and they bring it outside the cell, while your potassium goes back into the cell and there are about 2 ions, no? So what happens, I already mentioned that your sodium potassium pump will cause negativity into the cell. That is why from a more positive, which is negative 86, it brings back the cell membrane charge to a negative 90. No, because again, your potassium is brought into the cell and sodium goes out of the cell and you create a negative charge. Your sodium potassium pump creates a negative charge. So again, from a negative 94 because of potassium, it becomes a bit more positive because you add sodium. So it's negative 86, but it goes back to being more negative because of your sodium potassium pump. Did you get that? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I hope you can appreciate it better, no? Na negative 94 because of potassium, it becomes negative 86. Although it's negative, but as you can see, it's more positive na because it's nearer to zero. But because of the sodium potassium pump, it brings it back to a more negative state, which is your resting membrane potential is around mga negative 90. Okay, so again, if don't worry if you didn't get the negative 86 through the Goldman equation, just try it again in your free time. So the more you practice, the more you'll understand and get it. So we've already talked about the membrane potential. So now let's go to the action potential. When you say resting membrane potential, it is when your cell is at rest, no stimulus, nothing. But this time, let's go to the action potential. So what happens in an action potential? This is a typical depiction of your action potential. So the first stage is the resting stage. So for a neuron, no, you already saw that in the table in the previous slides that the neuron is around, the resting potential of the neuron is about negative 70. So that's when it is at rest. When there is a stimulus and an action potential happens, this undergoes depolarization. So as you can see from a negative 70, the charge inside the cell or inside the neuron becomes a bit more positive, and that is the depolarization stage. In fact, it may even reach a positive charge, no, as high as positive 35. And that is the term overshoot. No, if you go beyond zero, it's overshoot. And then just as quickly as the action potential happens, it goes back again to the resting stage. And this part here is what we call repolarization. Okay, repolarization. So before we delve into that, to the whole action potential, let's first talk about your voltage-gated sodium channels. So they are sodium channels. Are these passive or active transport?
Active, Doc.
Active.
Passive daw.
Passive,
Correct.
Doc.
Passive.
Correct.
Passive.
For those who said passive, no, very good. You can clap your hands. So why is this passive? Number one, look for ATP. Do you see ATP?
No.
Wala, no?
No.
Right. So if you don't see ATP, then that is not an active transport, no? Because again, when you say active transport, you say active because you need energy. So this one, another thing is it doesn't go against the concentration gradient. So this is from the outside, this is the inside. So your voltage gated sodium channel, maybe you were just confused because of the word voltage, no? So meaning there's a charge. So what it just means is that this sodium channel right here will open if there is a voltage, no, if there is a current. So at resting state, no, when the neuron is around negative 70 millivolts, this is how it looks like. Your sodium channels has two gates. It has the activation gate and the inactivation gate. So in the resting state, as you can see, the activation gate is closed. So no matter what happens, your sodium cannot get inside because it's closed, no? And the inactivation gate is open, but this is the one that's closed. So sodium cannot get in. However, when there's a stimulus, no? When there's a stimulus, for example, there's a charge, no? So because it's voltage gated, this will cause the activation gate to open and sodium now rushes into the cell. And because sodium is positive, it brings positivity inside the cell. So the cell from a negative 70 during rest, it can go as high as positive 35. And that is your part of your action potential already. But this happens very quickly in just a few seconds or a few fraction of a second. Your inactivation gate closes. So sodium cannot, sodium stops going into the cell. So if the cell has reached positive 35 here, when both gates are open and when the inactivation gate is now closed, so from a positive 35, it will gradually decrease back to a negative state. So this is your voltage-gated sodium channel. If we have voltage-gated sodium channel, we also have voltage-gated potassium channel. So passive or active transport?
Passive.
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 Correct. Passive. Correct. You don't see any ATP. So this is passive. So, and you see at resting state, the gate, and take note that your potassium channel has only one gate, just one gate, unlike your sodium channel. So your potassium channel at rest, the gate is closed. But when it's already activated, it will now open and potassium will slowly go out of the cell. And this happens usually at the repolarization stage. So potassium will go out of the cell there. So now let's talk about action potential, properly about action potential. So first, for an action potential to occur, we have to excite first the cell membrane. There must be an excitement. So what are the factors that can cause this excitement? So for the action potential to happen or for the cell membrane to get excited, there must be sodium. The cell membrane must be permeable to sodium, meaning that the cell membrane allows sodium to get inside. So, we've mentioned before that it's potassium that can freely go out and in of the cell. So, if ever the cell becomes more permeable to sodium, then that cell becomes excitable. So what are the factors that can cause sodium ions to diffuse inward? So number one is a mechanical disturbance of the membrane. So for example, this one, no, when there is when the sensory nerve endings in our skin are excited, no, this will create a mechanical disturbance of the cell membrane. And so this acts like a stimulus, which can cause the cell membrane to be more permeable to sodium. So sodium enters the cell. Another factor is your chemical factor. So chemical, when you hear the word chemical, it almost always means neurotransmitters. No? You're familiar with neurotransmitters. They help in the transmission of signals, and they also cause excitation of your cell membrane. And lastly, you also have passage of electricity through the membrane. So this happens in the cells of the heart and also the intestines. So this is how a real action potential looks like, no? So it's really if we plot it graphically, the curve is really it's really tall, no? And the depolarization stage is really steep. This is how the real action potential looks like. How about the smaller ones? What do we call them? We call them your acute subthreshold potentials. This is when, for example, the stimulus that you give, the neurotransmitters that arrive are not so many. They're not so strong. The stimulus is not so strong. So the action potential doesn't really happen. No? They create a current, but it does not reach the threshold. No? So it doesn't reach the threshold. If it doesn't reach the threshold, then it will never be like this. No? It will just come back down. So if just remember that if a weak stimulus happens, then it will just cause a local potential change at the membrane. No? But the intensity of the local potential must rise to a threshold. So it must go past this threshold. So in the 14th edition of Guyton, it says there that the threshold is around negative 55 millivolts. So now that we have already excited the cell membrane, what's the next step? Then we go to the initiation of the action potential. So the action potential happens. So we excite the cell membrane becomes permeable to sodium goes into the cell, and so action potential will start. So this is how it looks like, no? At the resting state, look at sodium. The value of sodium is very low, potassium is high. But when the stimulus is there and then the sodium starts going inside the cell, even surpasses that of potassium, no, the conductance. And then very briefly also after that, the sodium concentration goes down and then goes back to the resting stage. So this peak right here is the peak of your action potential. So take note that your action potential is a very good example of a positive feedback. We know that many mechanisms in the body for achieving homeostasis, it's all more or less it's negative feedback. Like for example, if you ate a lot, then you become hyperglycemic. There is much sugar in your blood. This will signal your pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin will cause your blood sugar to go back to normal. And so this will cause the pancreas to stop producing insulin. So that is the negative feedback. No, there if something happens, and then if something happens, your body will produce something to stop that from happening. And then once it's okay, it's back to normal, then that production will stop. So that's the negative feedback. But your action potential is positive feedback. No, so if an action potential happens in this part of the membrane, instead of stopping, it goes all the way. So that is your action potential. So as long as the membrane of the nerve fiber remains undisturbed, no action potential occurs. Meaning if there is no excitement, then there is no action potential. And the rising voltage will cause many voltage-gated sodium channels to begin opening. So we already talked about that, no? So the initiation of the action potential occurs only after the threshold potential is reached. As I mentioned, when you hear the word threshold, let's be uniformed in answering negative 55 millivolts, no? This is the threshold for stimulation. So So now we have started the action potential. What is next? The next is the propagation. Propagation, meaning the potential goes to other areas. No, so you can see in this picture, this is a normal resting nerve fiber. When you excite it, so for example, there are neurotransmitters that come. So in this area here, this becomes excited. This will become more permeable to sodium. So sodium enters and then action potential starts in this area. As you can see from a very negative inside the cell, no, the resting membrane potential is around -70 in the neuron. Once there is excitement, this area here becomes positive, no? And because we say that it's a positive feedback, the areas adjacent to that action potential will also become excited. And so the action potential will go to both directions, no? It will go away from the source of the action potential until that the whole neuron is, until that the whole cell is excited, and then an action potential happens. No? And this is what we call your propagation of the action potential, meaning it will propagate. It will go towards all directions, away from the source of the stimulus. So I've already mentioned this, the direction of propagation. It travels in all directions away from the stimulus until it will reach the end of the neuron, until it will reach the end of your cell. And we also have this all or nothing principle. So your all or nothing principle, meaning once their action potential is reached, no, the threshold is reached, then the action potential goes all the way. It doesn't stop, no? And the ratio of your action potential to your threshold must always be greater than 1 for it to have to be propagated to both directions. So now that we have propagated your action potential, what's next? Then we slowly, gradually go back to the resting stage. And here we will reestablish the sodium and potassium ionic gradients. So how do we do that? Again, by your sodium potassium pump. So, diba, after the action potential, it's expected there are more sodium inside the cell, right? And potassium has left the cell. So your body, no, it's very amazing that your body has your many sodium potassium pumps now within the cell membrane, because the sodium that is inside the cell, they will pump it out. No, they will pump it out. So sodiums that have diffused to the interior of the cell during the action potential and the potassium ions that have gotten outside, they will be returned to their original state. However, your sodium potassium pump requires ATP. No, requires ATP. And the pumping activity of the sodium potassium pump increases approximately in proportion to the third power of the intracellular sodium concentration, meaning the more sodium there is, no, inside the cell after the action potential, the greater is the pumping activity of your sodium potassium pump. So after your sodium potassium pump, no, that's the end of your action potential. What happens? So the cell will go through a refractory period. So what is a refractory period? When this is shortly after the action potential is initiated, the sodium channels and the calcium channels and all the channels are inactivated. So at this point, when you say refractory period, no excitatory signal applied to the channels, no matter how many neurotransmitters you give, then the cell will not create an action potential because it is in a refractory period. So, however, when from your resting potential of the neuron is -70, when there is an action potential, it even goes up to a +35. And then gradually goes down until it goes back to a -70 again. But if ever during the descent, no, from a +35 down to a -70, probably at around a -40, you give a really big stimulus, then the cell can go back to making another action potential. No. However, if the the charge of the cell will now be around at the resting membrane potential, which is negative 70, then no matter how big your stimulus is or how strong it will not cause an action potential for about a few seconds, no, a few fraction of a second. And this is what you call your absolute refractory period. Now, no matter how much stimulus you do, your cell will not create an action potential. So clinical correlation, no, with these things that we have mentioned. So there is what we call your drugs that are membrane stabilizers. For example, is your calcium. So always remember that calcium, no, the effect of calcium, or your calcium is more or less no friends with sodium. They're friends with sodium. So they are like sodium. They're more outside the cell than inside. And where sodium goes, calcium also follows, no? So joiner, friendly to calcium. So however, when there is low calcium, no, your sodium will not be balanced, no? It will not go, parang your calcium will be the one to modulate your sodium. So for example, if like your sodium is a very very excitable ion, no? So it needs calcium for it to be parang stable. But once calcium is gone, or for example, there is low calcium, your sodium and your sodium channels are very excitable, no? So they can freely open. And sodium can go into the cell, creating action potentials. That is why calcium is what we call your membrane stabilizers. No, for example, in cases like hyperkalemia, no, where the cell membrane is very excitable, one of the drugs that we give in patients with hyperkalemia is your calcium gluconate, because of this principle that calcium is considered a membrane stabilizer. Another drug, no, in relation to this concept of membrane stabilization is your local anesthetic. And like your lidocaine, no, very familiar. I'm sure you're familiar that lidocaine is an anesthetic. Its action is a sodium channel blocker. So if it blocks sodium, then it will stop the sodium, no, from going in. So it stops mga action potential. That's why you don't feel anything. Because there is no action potential, no transmission of impulse happens. Also, apart from that, aside from being an anesthetic, your lidocaine is also an antiarrhythmic, no? Because same principle, because it will cause membrane stabilization. So in summary, what happens in the action potential is this. So there is a stimulus in the form of possibly a mechanical force, chemicals like neurotransmitters, or even a bit of electrical charge. So this will now cause increased permeability of the sodium. And so sodium enters the cell very freely, and then action potential happens. This is the depolarization stage. And very quickly, when after the sodium channels are open, they become closed. And now your potassium channels are the one that's open. And then, so this is now the repolarization stage. So in the repolarization stage, after that, your sodium potassium pump will pump out, no, the excess sodium and will take back the potassium that has gone out of the cell. So finally, from a positive charge during the action potential, it will now go back to the negative resting membrane potential. And so awaiting for another stimulus. So this is a very simple way to explain what an action potential or how an action potential happens. No? So what are other important points? Number one, put it at the back of your head that there are also anions inside the nerve axon. It's not inside the nerve, it's not only potassium or chloride, there's also other anions. However, they are big anions, and they cannot go through the membrane channel. So examples of that are your protein, organic phosphates, sulfate compounds. They're big ions. So they remain inside the cell and they contribute to the negative charge inside the fiber. So another important point is your calcium. I've mentioned now that calcium is a best friend of sodium. Wherever sodium goes, most likely calcium follows. So if you have a sodium potassium pump, we also have a calcium pump. No, so your calcium pump acts the same way as your sodium sodium potassium pump, in the sense that it also transport calcium ions from inside to the outside, diba? So it's like your sodium potassium pump. It's the same way with a sodium potassium pump. So just like sodium, your calcium is pumped out of the cell by your calcium pump. Another kind of channel for your calcium is your voltage gated calcium channel. And as you can see, it has the same effect also with your voltage gated sodium channel. It also brings calcium into the cell. No? So same sila, your calcium and your sodium. Your voltage gated sodium channels are called slow channels. They're slow because from the word itself, they're slow to open. And this is important because this will cause a sustained depolarization, and usually we find these slow channels in your cardiac and your smooth muscle cells. And we will be talking about that in a few slides now. So I've already mentioned this, that calcium is very important, no? Because in cases where there is hypocalcemia, there is low calcium in your extracellular fluid, this will cause increased permeability of the sodium channels. No, there is nothing that can keep your sodium in check. No, it becomes more charged, more excitable, and so and more permeable to sodium, yung membrane. So the sodium goes into the cell, and this will cause action potential. And if this is not corrected and this is not stopped, then the muscle will have tetany, no, or continuous contraction of the muscles, because there is continuous production of action potentials. And this can be manifested, no, in the form of cramps. So sometimes when you have cramps, think about it, no, always ask yourself, did I drink milk, or do I have hypocalcemia? Is my calcium low? Because of this concept here. Good thing if your cramps are just here in the legs, no? What if the muscle that is affected is your diaphragm? Then you will have a problem, because you know that your diaphragm helps you in respiration. So this can affect any muscle in the body. This is also true to when you have surgery for hyperthyroidism, or surgery for your thyroid or goiter problem. And then you know that at the back of your thyroid lies your parathyroid gland. So of course they're very minute. Some surgeons will be able to cut them out, no, take them out as well. So your patient will be very prone to having hypocalcemia, because you know that parathyroid is very important in calcium metabolism or calcium control in the body. So that's also one factor. That's why after thyroid surgeries, us in internal medicine, we also monitor the calcium levels, no, of our patients. So that's for your action potential. So some special concepts that we have to also be familiar with is your plateau. That there are some action potentials that have a plateau. So just like this picture, if you see a plateau, no, this one is a plateau. Parang it's a bit of a flattening. So as you can see here, this is a very good depiction of a plateau, and this usually happens in the heart muscle fibers. Plateau, this one here, lasts for as long as about 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. And you may say, maybe that's very short, but in the action potential world, that's very long na, because diba, usually it's around milliseconds. But this time, this can last about 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. So what are the factors that can cause this plateau? Number one, in the heart, there are two channels, no, for depolarization. In other cells, it's only one. The cell that is responsible for depolarization is your sodium channels. But in the heart, aside from sodium, there's also the calcium channel. So here, in this area here, this is still the resting stage, no, of the heart. But when it's stimulated, when there is a stimulus, the action potential happens. As you can see, there is a very steep rise here. And this steep rise, no, for the voltage inside the heart cell is caused by your sodium channel. So that's why they're called fast, because it's the first one to open. So the sodium rushes into the cell becomes more positive, and then of course we know in the normal cell that after a few seconds it will go back down. So however, in the heart cell there's also another, the slow channel, that's the L-type calcium channel, and then they will open. So they're slow, no? So they're late to the party, but they open. And when they open, since they will cause the calcium to go inside the cell, so as you can see now, it was supposed to be going down already, the charge, but at this point, calcium channel opens, and calcium goes into the cell. So that's why there's a plateau. But of course, eventually the calcium channels will also close and your potassium channels will now open. And then this is now the repolarization stage, no? The gradual decrease of your charge inside the cell. Eventually, it goes back to the resting stage. So this is the repolarization stage again. No? This is where your voltage-gated potassium channels will open. So your potassium will leave the cell. So since it's a positive charge, when it goes out of the cell becomes more negative. That's why the negative charge is continuously going back to its resting membrane potential. So this is very special to cardiac cells. Now let's go to another concept, which is rhythmicity of some excitable tissues, or rhythmicity. So what does that mean? These special parts in the body will have rhythm, no? There is rhythmical beat, rhythmical movement. And this happens because these parts of the body, or these cells, these neurons, or sorry, not neurons, but these cells has an increased sodium permeability, and they also have a decreased threshold for stimulation. So instead of negative 55, they have lower millivolts that are needed for it to have an action potential, or if the membrane is easily permeable to sodium. So the special parts in the body that have this rhythmicity is in your heart, no? Because there is, we have beating of the heart. There's also here in the GIT, where there is peristalsis, and also in the rhythmical control of your breathing. So this happens because of these two factors. Either the threshold is very short or it's very small, or there is increased sodium permeability. Now we go to the special characteristics of signal transmission and nerve trunks. This is an example of a nerve trunk fiber. So this is just one nerve here, no? And as you can see, with the nerves there are different, the bigger ones, the bigger white ones are your myelinated fibers, myelinated. But interspersed, no, are the little white dots, and there are many white dots, and you call that your unmyelinated nerve fibers. So it is said that the average nerve trunk contains about twice as many unmyelinated fibers as myelinated, meaning there are many unmyelinated fibers compared to myelinated fibers. Let's talk about your myelinated fiber. So this is how a myelinated fiber looks like. The central of the fiber is your axon. Diba? The parts of the neuron, you have your dendrite, cell body, and then the axon. This is the axon right here. And you have the axoplasm, or the intracellular fluid inside the axon. And this is where the membrane of the axon is where your action potential happens, no? And your axon is protected, or there is something that goes around it, and this is your myelin sheath, the white one. The myelin sheath is made by your Schwann cell. This is your Schwann cell right here. So your Schwann cell produces your myelin, and actually your myelin sheath is composed of the lipid we call sphingomyelin. And your sphingomyelin is a good insulator, and this decreases your ion flow through the membrane about 5,000 fold. So here, in the parts of the axon where it is insulated, the charge is that the movement of the ions becomes lower because of the insulating effect of your sphingomyelin in your myelin sheath. So take note also that in the axon, there are about there are areas, no, mga 2 to 3 micrometers in length that do not have the myelin sheath, and we call that your nodes of Ranvier. So to appreciate that fully, the nodes of Ranvier are here, no, and they're about 2 to 3 microns in length. So a bigger picture is this one, no. The areas that do not have your myelin sheath. And this is very important because this will facilitate what we call your saltatory conduction. Meaning, when you say saltatory, no, in dance, it's like skipping or jumping. So instead of since your neurons are very long, no, I mean your axons are very long. So instead of the whole impulse to travel, all of the action potential to travel all the way, no, from here to here, because there is the myelin sheath, no, as insulator, what it does is it jumps, no, from one node of Ranvier to another. So now it becomes faster. No? The actual action potential only occurs at the nodes of Ranvier. And so they jump. They don't move na here. No? So the nerve impulse jumps along the fiber, and that is why we call it saltatory. So what is the importance of saltatory conduction? Number one, as I mentioned, it greatly increases the velocity of nerve transmission in myelinated fibers, as much as 5 to 50-fold. And the good thing about it is that it conserves energy for the axon. Why? Because remember, in a normal cell, we use the sodium-potassium pump, right? To help in re-establishing the resting membrane potential. After every action potential, your sodium-potassium pump will do its work. Remember, it will pump out the sodium back to the outside and bring in your potassium inside. And you know that your sodium-potassium pump consumes ATP, no? So it will consume ATP. So if there is already saltatory conduction in the axon, then you will need lesser sodium-potassium pumps. So that means that you will need less ATP. So this is a very efficient one. Process, no, in the nerve axon because of the saltatory conduction. And finally, if we compare it, no, for the unmyelinated and their very small fibers compared to your large myelinated fibers, there is really a very big difference because in the myelinated fibers, you can do saltatory conduction, no? Whereas in the small unmyelinated fibers, then you will have slower connection. So this one could be globe, and this one, your large myelinated fibers, could be, I don't know, or do we have anything similar in the Philippines? So I'm not sure. But maybe our connections here, no, in the Philippines are mga small unmyelinated fibers because they're very slow. So that ends my lecture for today. Do you have any questions? Did you get
Yes, Doc.
what I was? Yes, what's your question?
Where are the unmyelinated fibers usually located, Doc?
Where?
Yes, Doc.
Okay, that's a good question. They're located everywhere. So it's not they're not one, I mean, they're not separated. They're not just separated like in one body part, no. As you can see in that picture I shown you in a nerve trunk. When you say nerve trunk or a big nerve, there are actually several. It's actually a mixture of unmyelinated and myelinated fibers. So the answer is that it's everywhere. But that's a good question.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Doc. Regarding membrane potential, earlier when you mentioned in hyperkalemia, the cell is more excitable.
Yes. Sorry.
In hypokalemia, what is the membrane potential like? If in hyperkalemia, it's less it's hyper excitable.
Okay. Technically, in whether it's hyper or hypokalemia, the presence or the the abnormality of potassium per se will make your membrane really excitable, whether it's hyperkalemia or hypokalemia. Because in hyperkalemia, for example, no, when we relate it to clinical practice, in hyperkalemia, your cells they're prone to, if you're already in IM, no, you'll be looking at ECG changes. Your cells will be prone to undergoing asystole if it's hyperkalemia. However, in hypokalemia, you will be more prone to having mga ventricular fibrillation, no? So the answer to that is either it's high or low potassium, the cells will still be excitable or very irritable. And you can have either arrhythmias or possible mga standstill or asystole.
Ma'am, I have hello. I have the same question. So hypo and hyperkalemia. So those excitation of the cells causes this the arrhythmia, right?
Yes.
Mhm. So then why is only in the heart that is potentially dangerous? What about the other part of the other different parts of the body?
Well, I cannot really say no that it's really just the heart. In fact, if you have hypokalemia, like hypokalemia meaning low potassium, it's not only the heart that's dangerous. This can also lead to paralysis. Some patients will come to us, no, having weakness of your legs. So it doesn't only involve the heart muscle; it also involves your skeletal muscle as well. And even some patients will manifest with GI disturbances because it will also affect your smooth muscles. So it's not, we're just talking more on the heart because it's, of course, it's not really correct not to say, but the heart is really more quote unquote important. But the other cells, other parts of the body are also affected, whether it's hyper or hypokalemia. But maybe we're just stressing on the heart because it's the one that's really more life-threatening. Any more questions?
Excuse me, Doc.
Yes.
Doc, if there is a stimulation, Doc, and it will start to depolarize po, Doc, and it will follow, magfollow ang repolarization, Doc. Is it possible if there is another stimulation to continue the action potential instead of going back to its resting? Yes, Doc.
Yes, that's what I mentioned during the refractory period discussion. No? So from the resting stage, it will go up, to the depolarization stage, and then we'll go back down, right, to repolarization. So before it reaches your resting membrane potential, for example, -70, if it's around mga -40, and then you give a larger stimulus, then yes, it's possible for the cell to create another action potential because it has not reached back the resting membrane potential. So as long as it does not reach what we call your absolute refractory period, or it goes back to your resting membrane potential, then yes, you can have another action potential. And that is what happens during for example, tetany, or those muscles that are undergoing spasm. That's the thing that happens. Now, there is more stimulus that comes in before the cell can go back to the resting membrane potential.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay. Any more questions?
Excuse me, Doc, just out of curiosity, Doc, is there an advantage to having unmyelinated fibers? Because wouldn't it be more efficient for the transmission of nerve signals if myelinated than fibers?
Yes, no, that's a right question. That's a nice question. Haven't thought of that also, but maybe there's because later on, in the next chapters, when we talk about neurons and the nerve fibers, you will see that the smaller nerve fibers are the ones that carry the sensation for pain. Can you imagine if you have very sharp pain and then you have it using your large myelinated fibers, how sakit that is, how painful that is, no? So there are the small unmyelinated fibers are responsible for other sensations like your dull pain, no? Because if you can imagine, if the patient or you yourself will have that kind of pain transmitted by the larger nerve fibers, then that will be very painful for you. So I guess that's why there is a balance also. So, but the larger nerve fibers are the ones that are responsible for our quick actions, no? Because we need to be fast in that, our thinking process. So, but the lesser, not said lesser important, but if we just want to label them as such, no, the lesser important sensations, then they're governed by the smaller nerve fibers because we don't need them to be very fast. Okay.
Okay, Doc. Thank you, Doc.
Okay. Would you want your pain to be in the larger nerve fiber? I think that would be very painful, no? If you can see a patient having the regional complex regional pain syndrome, where the nerve fiber is really affected, you really feel bad for them, no? Just like House MD, no? He's always in pain. So, are there any other questions?
Good morning, Doc. I
Yes,
just
good
wanted to
morning,
ask.
Keith and your pandas.
I just wanted to ask about. You mentioned the calcium channel being an L-type channel, and I just remembered that these are the alternative names to these channels. So I wanted to ask, what were the other names? Because I only remember the T-type potassium channel and then the M. I forgot the other ones, like the definitions.
For what? For the sodium, for the L-type channel?
For the other letters, Doc, just wanted clarification on what the other letters meant. Since L-type is calcium, T is potassium, and
T as in tango?
Yes, Doc. Is that correct?
I think there's also T-type channel for calcium.
Oh, calcium. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Doc. For M, Doc.
M?
Yes, Doc.
M-type channel. I will have to refresh my memory on that. I will that will be my reading assignment.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay. I'll probably answer you in the next next lecture for the M-type channel. I'll see if I can remember. There's so many channels. I will not be the one to tell you I memorized everything.
Okay, Doc. No problem. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. If there are no questions, I understand your next subject is 9:30, no?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, so just like the other sections, no, just like the other sections yesterday, I will be giving a very short parang quiz, but it's just one question, parang multiple. Let's just say it's Miss Universe question. So just log in, and it's also for attendance. And if you get a good, attendance and score, no, for your exams later, I will add this to your exam. So this is the link. If you're section A, please click your link. For section C, just click your link. So I'll be giving you 10 minutes for that. Once it's 10 minutes, you cannot answer anymore. So please do not copy the previous sections. They copied, no, from the internet. I really don't like that. No, don't. It's one of my pet peeve.
Ma'am, the link saying it says unavailable.
Oh, really?
No permission. Yeah, you need permissions.
Need permission, Doc.
You need permission.
Try using your Maham email, guys, so that you can access it.
Will you be able to access it if Maham email?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Sige. Section A. What other? Section C. In your own words, guys, no need to use mga highfalutin curva. So my clock is around 9:06. So around 9:16, I will close it.
Hello, Doc. I
Yes.
can't access the
You are section A or C?
section A, Doc. Me too, Doc. Section A.
If you can't access A, try daw section C. Just indicate your name lang, you're from section A.
Doc, I can't access the...
Even A?
Yes, Doc.
Have you tried using your
Wait lang.
email?
Me
Doc,
too,
okay na,
Doc.
Doc.
Have you tried using daw your Maham email?
Yes, Doc. Okay na siya, Doc. Wait lang, Doc.
Okay. Okay, so na yung mga early passers. If you're done, you can leave the room. Thank you very much for listening.
Excuse me, Doc. How do I know it was already sent, Doc?
There's no parang confirmation.
Close mo good ako, Doc.
Who are you? Who are you?
Gadan, Doc.
Section
A, Doc.
A. Yes, John Philip.
Yes, Doc. Thank you, Doc.
Yes, yes, it's here. Okay, thank you.
Ay, Doc.
Hmm.
Wala na ko siya nabutangan o section A, Doc. Flores. Nasubmit na ako. Sorry, Doc.
Section A?
Yes, Doc. Pero sa section A ko nag-open.
Yes, section A ka, but you're in section C, no?
Yes, Doc.
Sige lang, okay. I think I have your names naman po in your in the class record.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Guys, wala ka access sa file even if maham email na inyong gamit.
Yes, Doc. Pag ko ka-access, Doc. Sorry, Doc.
Who are you? Kinsa ka?
Operator firstly, Doc.
Firstly?
Yes.
Wait lang ha.
Sorry, Doc.
Firstly.
I'm still figuring out, Doc.
But you use na the Maham?
Yes, Doc. I already did.
Can you message me your email? dire sa Zoom.
Okay, Doc. Thank you, Doc.
Sige.
I'll send you both my emails na lang, Doc. Okay lang.
Okay, sige.
Ma'am, I submitted.
All right. If you're done, then if you have submitted, then you can